Closed captioning of this program is made possible by the Fireman's Fund Foundation.
The passing of Apple icon and visionary Steve Jobs brings faithful fans out to mourn and raises speculations over what's next for one of the world's most valuable companies. The nationwide Occupy Wall Street movement takes hold in the Bay Area with protests against the country's financial system, but the encampment in San Francisco is broken down by police. And the future of California's booming medical marijuana industry is less certain with new federal regulations and dispensaries and their property owners. Also, a look at Nobel Prize-winning UC Berkeley scientist Saul Perlmutter, who discovered the universe is expanding even faster than we thought. And remembering political reporter Rollin.
On the other hand, the death of George Moscone leaves the
coming up next. Good evening, I'm Belva Davis, and welcome to This Week in Northern California. Joining me on our news panel are Michael Montgomery, reporter for KQED News and California Watch; Mark Calvi, San Francisco Business Times reporter; and Laura Seidel, digital culture correspondent with NPR. Laura, have we ever seen the kind of outpouring of grief for a CEO as we've seen with the passing of Steve Jobs?
You know, I have never seen anything like this in my lifetime, and I can't imagine a CEO that people feel this way about. There was a kind of magic that Steve Jobs had, but more importantly, it was the magic he brought to his products. This is a guy who from very, very early on in his life was really believed that you could infuse machines with emotion, that you could make people feel something about a machine. And I think his products did that successfully. You know, you talk to people about their Mac, and they are often in love with them, right? I mean, what other product do you feel that way about? You know, and so I think he had an ability to do that. He always talked about how he had the best computer scientists who were also artists and poets and musicians, and that he brought arts and humanities into technology.
Was it this cross of entertainment and business function that did it? Is that it?
I think not just that, it's also that he made things easy to use. He really was gearing his products towards the average schmo, towards the person who didn't know how to use a computer. And I think you often don't see that in other companies. I mean, I've covered a lot of these companies in Silicon Valley, and I don't think they take the care. He really took care. He was a difficult boss sometimes. People will tell you that, but he had a way of bringing people up to do their absolute best work. People would say, yeah, he's difficult, but he's a genius. And, you know, his head designer, Johnny Ive, came up with these amazing designs. They work closely together, where, in a way, the technology takes a backstage to the thing you want to use it for. It's very simple. And so people would fall in love with the device. They could make it theirs.
Do you think his death marks the end of an era?
I do. I mean, I have to say, I've probably sat, you know, and listened to him unveil a product now over a dozen times. And there was something about him. I mean, I was at Apple the day before he died. They unveiled the iPhone 4S. And Tim Cook got up there, you know, he has a nice way about him. But he's not Steve Jobs. There was something about the passion that Steve had that just came through, and I don't think we'll see that again, you know. And
well, I wanted to ask you about Tim Cook, the current CEO. He's been at the helm for a while, a few years now, a couple years now. What about that question of the magic? I mean, it's bound to continue to be a successful company, probably no doubt about that. But this sort of notion of a revolutionary company or a company with this incredible magic. What do you see in your crystal ball on that?
Not that I have a crystal ball, but there's a couple things I would say. One is I think for a while we'll still see great products because there were things in the pipeline that he put in the pipeline. I think one of the things, is my understanding that Steve felt strongly about, was developing a team that understood how he thought. Strangely enough, though, that's almost contrary to, I think, what made Steve Jobs, which is that he was an iconoclast. I mean, this is a guy, he dropped out of Reed after 6 months. He went to India, he did LSD, he dabbled in Buddhism and Hinduism, and, he was not your ordinary CEO. He didn't go to business school. He didn't do all those kinds of things. He was an old hippie. And I think a lot of what you see now in Silicon Valley, they want to be nonconformist, but I don't think they have that something that he had, that kind of magic, as you say.
But he wasn't trusting to fate that somebody would come along and duplicate his magic. I mean, he did establish an internal organization to try to train people, to try to transfer this. How did that work?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, Apple University, which is what they're calling it, is supposed to teach the Apple management style. But of course, that's hard to imagine because part of it was his charisma. I mean, this was a guy, he had you eating out of his hand. I used to get out of these press conferences where he would introduce whatever he would introduce. And sometimes, of course, it was revolutionary, a word he liked to use. When he introduced the iPad, he called it revolutionary. But I would always call my editor and say, okay, get me down to reality, because I've been in the Steve Jobs famous field of distortion, and that was really special. I think there are probably things you can teach.
Okay, there are a few people around that probably could learn from his magic. They're in the financial institutions of this country, and we're going to turn to Mark now and talk about what's going on. And there is not a lot of love on the table.
You've got that correct. There were several protesters again today in front of the San Francisco Federal Reserve, minus the tents, but they were still there protesting what I think they would call the tyranny of Wall Street. They're upset with a lot of what's wrong with our economy today. For many Americans, the nation's economy simply isn't working for them, whether it's foreclosures or the long-term unemployment. And even such down-to-earth issues like student loans, not being able to discharge those in bankruptcy, was part of the topic of discussion with the protesters when I went down there this morning.
But wasn't the main complaint I heard is that this is a group, there are actions across the country, New York here and there, but it seems unfocused.
It does. I think you're right about that, but let's look at the Arab Spring. That also looked unfocused, didn't have a list of demands there either or a leader. But I think this is the new world of protest within social networking, that there can be a coalescing. And I think a lot of observers are saying, give this time. They're tapping into a very deep channel of public anger, which is likely to spur changes in our country.
Let me ask you on that point. I mean, prior to the official creation of the Tea Party movement, we saw a lot of unfocused anger. Are there any, I mean, I don't want to overplay that, but are there some parallels here, do you think, that it could coalesce and actually channel into a real political movement or force?
I think so. I think what's going to happen over time is people are going to latch on to maybe some key issues like the student loan debt, which is such a problem, or unemployment, especially when you're coming out of college in this environment where I've heard CEOs call the college placement office a ghost town in this era. So I think over time, issues will percolate up that people will gravitate to. What I thought was interesting this week is I'm hearing similar things about the Federal Reserve and criticism from the people protesting on the street as I'm hearing from Steve Forbes, who sees the day the American dollar is once again linked to gold. When you've got both sides of the argument, echoing the same point, I think that again reinforces the idea change is coming. I spoke with one of San Francisco's top financiers, Warren Hellman, this week. He thinks the protests are important and need to be watched because just like in the early 30s, protests of this nature led to some of our strongest securities laws. In fact, even the creation of the Securities and Exchange Commission.
Do you think there's a difference between the protesters here in the Bay Area and what you're seeing in New York? Do you see some difference?
Yes, because in New York they have thousands gathering. They're becoming much more maybe aggressive or adopting the rules of civil disobedience in New York with the blocking the Brooklyn Bridge. I think in the Bay Area, maybe because we're so used to protests that it's taking time, but I know this morning a lot of people were honking in sympathy as they drove past the protest.
The banks seem to have not got it quite yet because the announcement by Bank of America about fees for using your ATM,
Yes.
debit card.
Yeah,
Also happened at about the same
I think
time?
some observers feel like Bank of America and the Washington, D.C. are in a catfight of some sort, and the American people are losing in the middle. The same day that President Obama sent his jobs bill up to over to Congress, B of A confirmed they're going to lay off 35,000 over a few years. They're shutting down some of their mortgage operations. They're putting in this $5 monthly debit card fee. They're just, it seems like banks aren't listening yet, but I know the level of anger is there that I'm confident they're going to start getting the message.
I guess I wonder, you said also that many of the people you spoke to here were really articulate, and that's something maybe I want to say that we haven't always heard about the people in New York, but you and I were talking earlier, you said you were kind of surprised.
I was very surprised that they were able to discuss. They feel like the Federal Reserve is the root of the problem. They understood. They were discussing issues like the fractional reserve banking system that we have in this country. This is not your grandfather's protest, in my opinion, with the level of understanding of economics. It reminded me of Michael Moore doing a premiere of his film Capitalism: A Love Story here in town, and somebody afterwards said, "Why didn't you focus more on the Federal Reserve?" And Michael Moore laughed and he goes, "I'm usually having to deal with issues like, did the guy get the girl? Not the Federal Reserve." So times are changing.
What about the president, talking about this?
I think he's listening. He was saying he's watching these protests very carefully. He understands the anger toward the banks. I think our presidential candidates, President Obama and next year with the election, I think they're going to be doing a lot of listening to the people on the streets and even in our halls of power about what changes may have to be made.
Certainly all three stories interesting and worth watching. My thanks to all of you for joining me here on the program tonight. Michael Montgomery, I'm not putting you on the air. Well, Michael, you have a difficult story here for medical marijuana people, and I don't think I've ever quite done that before. But they're already getting a bad road from the federal government, and I'm cutting them off the air.
Well, what really has happened today, we had a press conference with the 4 U.S. attorneys standing side by side, and they really did throw down the gauntlet to the medical marijuana industry in the state. And using that terminology, industry, and really saying that they are going to go after the sort of economic foundation. And we've seen prosecutions over the years. We've seen a cat and mouse game between the feds and local marijuana, medical marijuana folks. What's different now is they're saying to property owners, if you rent or lease your land or your buildings to either medical marijuana dispensaries, although the feds don't use that term, they call them stores, or to growers, like in the Central Valley, which is a growing issue, we might just seize your land. And that has gotten the medical marijuana world very worried. And I think that the federal government really tried to show that they're very serious about this. This isn't an idle threat. And they made that point by standing side by side, the 4 U.S. attorneys, and really, like I said, I think throwing down the gauntlet. And there have been other issues. Tax, the IRS is getting involved with dispensaries. Banks are cutting business ties with dispensaries. There's been some court rulings. Even the ATF now says to gun dealers that you shouldn't be selling firearms to people who are medical marijuana users.
Won't this hurt state and local governments here in California with tax revenues?
Well, that's the argument that a lot of the advocates are making. The estimates are that California earned about $100 million in taxes for medical marijuana. Local governments, Oakland, for example, it does quite well on taxing medical marijuana sales or dispensaries. So yes, local governments, state government, but particularly local government will take a hit. The irony is the federal government is saying to local governments, you can't regulate this. It's illegal to try to set up regulatory structures for medical marijuana. Now we'll see what happens with places like Oakland or San Francisco that have these regulatory systems set up.
You know, thinking about the fact that yes, it's jobs, it's tax dollars, why now? Why would the federal government be coming in now?
Well, there are those who see a conspiracy here, all these things happening at the same time. I know that the U.S. attorneys have been working on this since last year. And it's taken them a long time to get things ready, get things lined up. What they're saying is it's out of control. California has become the biggest supplier of marijuana to the rest of the country. Medical marijuana is going to non-medical marijuana states. It's become a big headache, and it's become a big headache for law enforcement. That's what the cops and the feds are saying. So they're saying, implicitly, California hasn't got its act together on this, and we, the feds, have to take bigger action.
What about this largest supplier of medical marijuana that seems to really be on the hook here? for an awful lot of money or an awful
Well,
lot of trouble?
this is Harborside Healthcare. This is in Oakland. It's the largest dispensary in California, probably in the West Coast, possibly the country. They've had a long-running battle with the IRS over their business deductions, and they lost at least the first round of that battle. IRS says they owe them $2.4 million. The owner of Harborside, Steve D'Angelo, says if they do that to Harborside and other dispensaries, they'll wipe out the industry. They will appeal, but it's unclear whether they'll win.
Why would they appeal in light of this new move, what the government is
Well,
saying?
they're saying that they should be entitled to deduct regular government operating expenses, and the feds right now say no. But this is the IRS. It's not the U.S. Attorney's Office.
A question about, I mean, do you see evidence that in fact there is a lot of criminal activity around this? There are reasons that the Fed really should be worried. Are you seeing that?
Well, we see indictments all the time, and we certainly, there's clear evidence of growers growing large quantities of marijuana in California and shipping to other states where the profits are higher. The marijuana grown in California, high quality marijuana from California, goes for 2 or 3 times the price in other states. So there's definitely a lot of trafficking. There's been an uptick in violence, not so great that it's on the front pages of the newspapers, but the police are definitely worried about
Any
that.
rumors of clubs that have just decided to fold it? And
Not yet,
go along?
but as of today, dozens of letters have gone out to property owners, including the Bay Area, including parts of Northern California, Southern California. They've been given 45 days to cease operations or face possible seizure of the property.
And that applies to the property owners plus
That's
what
right.
they have on the property. Well, again, my thanks to all of you for joining me here tonight.
A pleasure.
Well, UC Berkeley scientist Saul Perlmutter is one of 3 to share this year's Nobel Prize in Physics. Research on distant exploding stars led to the startling discovery that the universe is being stretched by dark energy and expanding at an accelerated rate. In this excerpt from KQED's Quest series, Perlmutter explains how he made his discovery.
And I think I was just one of those kids who always thought that we should know how the world works around us, that here we live on this earth and we don't fall through the floor, and somebody should have given us an owner's manual about how the whole thing fits together and how you use it.
In 1998, Perlmutter was part of one of 2 teams that discovered the expansion of the universe had started to accelerate 7 billion years ago. But what exactly does it mean that the expansion is accelerating? First, you have to understand the universe is infinite, not an easy concept to grasp.
Just imagine that you are living here on a galaxy, and there's galaxies forever going that way, and there are galaxies forever going that way, and there are galaxies forever going that way. And just imagine that there's sort of a typical distance between those galaxies. And the only thing I mean when I'm saying that the universe is expanding is that we're sort of pumping extra space between the galaxies. And when we say it's accelerating, we just mean that that extra pumping is happening faster and faster, and the distances are growing bigger and bigger more and more quickly.
So how did Perlmutter's team figure out the history of the universe? They did so by looking at the light from supernovae, stars that exploded billions of years ago.
And we're
Sitting in a room at the Berkeley lab, Perlmutter and physics student Hannah Swift are connected to one of the world's largest telescopes, the KQED in Hawaii. The other half of their team is actually in Hawaii. Their plan for the night is to confirm that 5 supernovae, previously identified through another telescope, are the type 1A supernovae they need for their research.
The type 1A supernovae explode in a very similar way every time, and so they brighten like fireworks and then fade away, but they reach the same peak brightness.
Their predictability makes these exploding stars what researchers call standard candles. Their initial brightness is constant, and it grows fainter with distance. And since researchers know light always travels at 186,000 miles per second, they're able to calculate how long ago these supernovae exploded.
When a supernova explodes, the light starts spreading out in all directions, much like the ripples on the water spread out when you drop a pebble into the lake. The range in which we were studying the supernova to see the acceleration was so far away that the light was coming towards us from a time where the clouds of gas were coalescing into what became our solar system. While the light is traveling to us through the universe is expanding. And everything in the universe that's not nailed down expands with the universe. And that includes the very wavelengths of the photons of light that are traveling to us from the supernova.
If the object is moving away from the observer, it will appear red. In astronomy, this phenomenon is known as redshift.
Now, with these two ingredients, the brightness of the supernova and how much the light has been shifted towards the red in its appearance, you now can just read off the history of the expansion of the universe, because the brightness tells you how far back in time any given supernova event occurred. The redshift, as we call it, tells us how much the universe has expanded since that time. And now we just do this for 5, 10, 20, 40 supernova at different times back in history. And they, one after another, tell us for each time in history how much the universe has stretched since that time.
But even though astronomers have become the historians of the universe, they can only speculate about what's causing this stretching.
One example of a slightly more exotic explanation could be that there's extra dimensions in the universe beyond the 3 dimensions that we're aware of space and the 1 dimension of time. Perhaps in some way we're limited to the dimensions that we experience, but that other things, like perhaps gravity, could not be limited, and maybe it can seep into one of these extra dimensions. And that would make it look to us as if it was becoming diluted, that you're having less effective gravity, and perhaps that's one of the reasons the universe could be accelerating.
Or the accelerated expansion could actually be caused by a new form of energy. This dark energy might be the missing force that sheds light on how gravity, the force that works on a large scale, fits in with the forces that bind atomic particles together. Could this undiscovered form of energy be the key to a unified theory of everything?
You can try out, almost any crazy idea. And that doesn't mean that any crazy idea will be the right one, but it allows you to play a little bit. And then we're hoping that we'll get actual measurements that will pin down the theorists into some set of answers that could be possible.
Researchers say that the only way to discard the inaccurate hypotheses is to come up with an ever more precise history. This will require observing more supernovae up closer. To do this, Perlmutter's team designed a satellite that would carry a telescope more powerful than the Hubble into space. The design of the Supernova Accelerator probe, SNAP for short, inspired NASA and the Department of Energy to join in a joint dark energy mission. Incorporating ideas from SNAP and other proposals, scientists expect to have the mission's final design soon. So long as dark energy continues to be a mystery, it's unclear what the future of the universe might be. It could well be that in billions of years, the universe will stretch into nothingness, or the whole thing could reverse and contract into a big collapse. For now, Perlmutter is enjoying his privileged vantage point.
In some sense, we may have found just the right spot to come to. So we're at just the right scale to be able to enjoy looking out at the infinite space above us and down into the microscopic world beneath us. We're, I think, at just about the right time in history to be able to look back at the early, hot, fiery Big Bang period and project into the future of what we might get to see. In some sense, we're in a very cozy medium, and I think it's a nice place to be.
And before we close tonight, it is with great sorrow that I report the death of my friend and mentor, political reporter Rollin Post. He died Monday at the age of 81 after a long and distinguished career. We worked together at 3 television stations over a span of 33 years. First at KPIX, then here at KQED, where he was a member of the newsroom staff and other programs. He then moved to KRON-TV. Rollin's knowledge of state and local politics couldn't be matched. Known by many as the Dean of Political Newscasting, he was often called on for his opinion on national issues. He inspired those around him to love and respect what a democratic society offers each individual, and that is the right and the obligation to speak out about how we are governed. He loved the principles behind politics, if not always the practice. The UC Berkeley grad covered 9 presidential campaigns and 18 national conventions. Work brought us together. While we shared little in our backgrounds, we did share the same values about the importance of journalism and its role in maintaining an open society. He often put his relationship with key contacts on the line by speaking up for me when my race and gender provided roadblocks to access. It was from him that I learned much of what has shaped my career. Rollin Post was a no-frills reporter who seldom courted the spotlight, but his reputation was so strong that when the producer of the classic political film The Candidate was being made, starring Robert Redford, he was asked to play himself, the tough questioner. He had 3 passions in his life: his family, politics, and baseball. He leaves behind his wife of 57 years, Diane, daughters Lauren and Cynthia, and son Kenneth, as well as 5 grandchildren. For more on the life of Rollin Post, the legacy of Steve Jobs, and the federal government's new crackdown on medical marijuana, please visit us online at kqed.org/thisweek. While there, you can also watch the complete Quest story about Saul Perlmutter. I'm Belva Davis. Good night.
Major funding for Quest on This Week in Northern California is provided by the National Science Foundation, the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, the Richard and Rhoda Goldman Foundation, and the Amgen Foundation. Additional support is provided by the following: